townships. The point I want to make here is that all of this resistance never succeeded in really changing the balance of physical coercive power. The whites always effectively retained a monopoly on military and physical force. And the anti-apartheid movement never really changed that. They didn't defeat the South African regime militarily. The balance of power never changed. What happened, and what I think was crucial, is that the apartheid regime, which had enjoyed considerable legitimacy among Europeans and Americans up until at least the 1950s, began to lose its legitimacy. Up to that point, in Britain and in other parts of Europe, there was tremendous sympathy for what was called the predicament of whites in Africa in the context of decolonization. The loss of legitimacy and the practices of the apartheid regime is what changed. And when a system loses its legitimacy, all the weapons in the world cannot protect it. And that's what we saw in South Africa. Once it got to a point that the regime could only remain in power through violence and repression, whites in South Africa lost the will to maintain it, because they knew that the price was increasing international isolation and being seen as pariahs. And once they reached that point, then they were willing to start talking about democracy and equal rights. You have to remember that the African National Congress put forward the Freedom Charter in 1955. It never changed. The message from the resistance in South Africa was consistent. Our demand is for freedom, for one person, one vote, for equality, for decolonization. It never changed. But as long as whites felt immune to the effects of apartheid, as long as they could get away with it, they had no incentive to read the Freedom Charter. And they could demonize Africans as much as they wanted and say these people are barbarians, and if we were to let them get their hands on the levers of power, they would slaughter us in our beds, whites would be thrown into the sea. It was costless for them to say that. Once internal resistance and international solidarity in the form of boycott, divestment, and sanctions raised the cost of the status quo for the apartheid regime and those who benefited from it, then they said, okay, let's talk. Let's hear what you have to say. Now we want to know what your vision is for the future of South Africa. So BDS created the conditions for dialogue and ultimately for an end to the conflict that were impossible as long as that balance of power was unchallenged. I would argue that we're beginning to see, I don't think it's yet at full speed, but we're beginning to see a similar loss of legitimacy for Zionism and for the practices that Israel has engaged in. And many Israelis worry about this very openly. I am convinced that the loss of legitimacy of the Zionist idea, of the idea of a special state for a special people, is irreversible. That cannot be resurrected in the 21st century, a time of when we at least preach, if not practice, universal rights and equality. Israel's self-image as a liberal, Jewish and democratic state is impossible to maintain against the reality of a militarized, ultra-nationalist, sectarian Jewish settler colony that has to carry out regular massacres of indigenous civilians in order to maintain its control. Zionism simply cannot bomb, kidnap, assassinate, expel, demolish, settle, and lie its way to legitimacy and acceptance. And 62 years of Palestinian steadfastness, sumud, resistance, have proven that time and again. And I think, as I've mentioned, it's ever harder to disguise this loss of legitimacy when you have a Jewish minority ruling over a disenfranchised Palestinian majority. Recently, you will have noticed the Israeli government's new demand that Palestinians recognize Israel's quote-unquote right to exist as a Jewish state as a condition for peace. Many people are outraged by that. I'm frankly quite comforted by it. Because, I'll tell you why. Because that demand is really an acknowledgement of failure. It's an acknowledgement that without Palestinian consent, the Zionist project of a Jewish ethnocracy in Palestine cannot be maintained, and I think it has zero long-term prospects. And I think what is so significant about the moment we're in is that the Israel lobby, the many pro-Israel groups in this country and around the world recognize this moment. And if you look back to last spring, to May, the speech given by the executive director of AIPAC at its annual policy conference. AIPAC is, of course, the most powerful pro-Israel lobbying group. And this was just months after the massacres in Gaza. And Howard Kaur, the executive director, made really quite a remarkable and revealing speech in which he talks about the increasing discourse about the illegitimacy of what Israel is doing and how it's constituted. It says, the epicenter of this campaign, he talks about the campaign of what he calls a campaign to delegitimize Israel. I would say that Israel has delegitimized itself through its actions, but let's just stay with him for a minute. This epicenter of this campaign may be in the Middle East, but the campaign doesn't stop there. It echoes in the halls of the United Nations and the capitals of Europe. But the campaign doesn't stop there. It is voiced without shame and without sanction in meetings of international organizations that claim peace and partnership as their mandate. But the campaign doesn't stop there. It is coming home right here to the United States. We see it already on our college campuses. America's elite institutions of higher learning, the places we've entrusted with the education of our children. But the campaign doesn't stop there. No longer is this campaign confined to the ravings of the political far left or far right, but increasingly it is entering the American mainstream. An ordinary political discourse on our TV and radio talk shows, in the pages of our major newspapers, and in countless blogs, in town hall meetings on campuses and city squares, in Los Angeles, in Fort Lauderdale, in Chicago. He calls this I think is very crucial to understand the fear of the Israel lobby. This is a conscious campaign to shift policy to transform the way Israel is treated by our friends to a state that deserves not our support but our contempt. And I'm skipping. These voices are laying the predicate for abandonment. They're making the case for Israel's unworthiness to be allowed what is for any nation the first and foremost fundamental of rights, the right to self-defense. Of course, that's in the context of the massacres in Gaza